I'm a big fan of your YouTube channel, so this is quite the honor. But I tasted the wine and nearly retched. At that point, I was absolutely hooked. For anyone who goes through the process, they'll have a bit of a different story. There were times in the MW program, it was quite humbling, but the concerning part of it is the amount of counterfeit wine. The setbacks were actually motivation to continue on. The most difficult aspect was actually, I've got to say, there was a time I could not stand having another glass of wine. And again, we're talking, moving hundreds of millions of dollars. One of the concerning areas that I see in that market, I mean, I think what you're doing is something that has a lot of value.
This podcast was in the making for quite a long time. Hello everybody, this is the Counterfeit podcast. This is episode 10 and our guest is Bobpaulinski. He's one of only 416 Master of Wines. He became a Master of Wine in 2002 when he broke the ice in the US. There was 4 years when nobody could pass the Master of Wine exam, and Bob was the first one to break the ice and finish. He has more than 40 years of experience in the wine industry, both as a shop owner and in corporate jobs. So he is a very, very well-versed and knowledgeable person in the wine industry. Welcome, Bob, and thank you for joining.
Oh, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a big fan of your YouTube channel, so this is quite the honor.
Well, it's an honor for me as well, and I can say the same thing for your YouTube channel. Actually, you were I think the first person who gave some feedback on the podcast, a person who I was also following. So it was a very nice moment when I was watching your videos and you gave some feedback on my podcast. That felt very good, and it's an honor for me as well.
It meant to be.
Exactly. And also we should tell the audience that this podcast was in the making for quite a long time. We were trying to organize it, but our schedules were misaligned. Some weeks I was traveling, another week Bob was traveling. There were lots of events, so we were postponing, but finally this is the day.
Yeah, fantastic.
Exactly. How are you? What are you up to?
Oh, good. I'm good. I'm in Northern California. I'm at my home. It's rainy here, which is fantastic for this time of year. Usually this is the start of the dry season.
Exactly.
I live near Napa, near Sonoma. And all the rain that we've had over this winter is a wonderful thing. It's been needed. And now we need some warmth. We need to get the growing season started.
Exactly. So it's in the morning, it's 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. there.
It is. Yeah, it's 9 a.m.
9 a.m. Okay. It's 7 p.m. here. So yeah, in very different time zones. Perfect. I think we should start at the beginning of your story. We already talked about this, how your career started. It was a very interesting story, how you discovered your passion for wine at the previous job. How did that happen?
I think for most people, when you get into the wine trade, it happens with some sort of story. Oftentimes, I think people have a bit of an aha or this epiphany moment where it just catches their attention. And it's the same for me. I grew up in a blue-collar, middle-class family, no connection to wine whatsoever. I grew up in Metro Detroit, and I ended up just landing a job in a nice wine shop in an affluent suburb of Detroit. And there was an older gentleman there who I had a nice connection with. He became a good friend. He was a wine geek, and there was the aha moment for me. There was a day, again, at this time, I'm about 18 years old, and I'm working in the store. I'm stocking shelves, and I drove a truck and, did that sort of work. And every evening at the end of the night, he would have a late night supper and a glass of wine. And one day he was going through his usual routine, and he said to me, "Hey, Polish boy, come here. I have something for you." And he had a glass of wine. He said, "Here, I want you to try this." And I remember exactly what the wine was.
Wow.
But I tasted the wine and nearly retched. I thought, "Oh, this is just god awful." And he laughed, of course, and he gave me a book, and it was the gold standard back in that day. I think it's still around. It's the Alexis Lachine Encyclopedia of Wine. So this is in the pre-internet days, and here's a book that's really a doorstop. Read about this wine, and we'll talk about it tomorrow. And I took the book home, and I read about the wine. The wine that he had me taste was a 1966 Chateau Cantenac Brown Margaux.
Wow.
Classic.
So it was quite a special wine, not just a...
But in the context for me, it was awful.
Course.
And so that night, I read a little bit about the wine estate, but it was more about reading the history of wine, its connection with business and art and religion and politics and business and all of these aspects that really grabbed my interest. And that for me was the start point. After that, I spent the next 4 years with him, essentially tasting through this wine store.
Yeah.
And he would say to me, "Okay, this month we will focus on Bordeaux." And that's all we would taste for a month. And then we would go to another region. It would be Alsace or Tuscany or whatever it might be. That formed the foundation for me. And at that point, I was absolutely hooked.
Wow, that's very interesting. What was his motivation? Because as you mentioned, he organized quite a very professional wine education for both of you. Why did he do it? Did he have a plan, or what was he trying to achieve with this? Because I think that this is a very rare and special occasion.
I think what happened was this. I think he reached out to gauge my level of interest. And if it's something that caught my attention and I chose to pursue it, he was there to help me along the path. And if not, things would have taken a very different course. But I think it was done just out of being a good person who wanted to gauge my level of interest. But shortly after, and again, I think, at this age, I'm 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. Oftentimes at that age, your thoughts change in terms of where you think your life, where you'd like to take your life. And for me, I had clarity at a very early age. So my efforts were all focused on, okay, I'm working for the store. I'm a young kid. I've got a lot of energy and I've got all this enthusiasm, but I lack experience. I don't have the financial resources. But in my early 20s, excuse me, at the age of 23, I put together enough of a financial backing and a business plan where I opened a retail store. And so I went in the business for myself with a specialty wine retail store at age 23. Sounds absurd. And in many ways, I think it probably was. In retrospect, it was a crazy risk. But through some twists of fate, it actually worked out well. And I had that business for nearly 20 years before I sold it.
Wow, that's a great success story. But I want to go back a little bit to the first tasting, which seems very interesting to me, that when you tasted the wine, you didn't like it, but still after you read about wine in general and when you researched the intellectual or the data based part of it catched you, and that's what piqued your interest.
So when I tasted this wine, this was in the early 80s. So that wine was 15 years old.
Yeah.
And for people that are dialed into vintages in Bordeaux, 66 is a phenomenal year. I mean, one of the great classic vintages. 60s had a lot of really god-awful vintages, but 66, of course, 61 was a classic vintage as well.
Yeah.
So for me, the interest wasn't so much in that specific wine. It was more about the whole culture of wine and what it meant. And as someone who was just getting in and just had a tiniest spark of interest, for me, I thought about wine as, well, it's something that you drink and you get a little bit inebriated, and the story on it doesn't go very deep. Well, what I discovered quickly was it was like a thread on a sweater. You pull it and it just keeps going.
Yeah.
And the story is very deep. And the more that I delved into it, the more it caught my interest. And my thought was, okay, it's all these amazing places around the world that I can only dream of maybe one day going to. So, my vision of it was, it caught my interest. I knew that obviously there was a tremendous amount for me to learn, but I also discovered that one of the appealing aspects with wine world, the wine trade, you never know everything. There's always something new. There's some sort of new technology that comes into play. There's a new region that becomes relevant. And for me, I found that very appealing. There was always some sort of new experience waiting to be enjoyed.
Of course. So it surprised you that it is such a complex world. You thought before this experience, you thought that this is just a simple drink, and after it, when the window just opened in front of you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, I think this is quite a typical experience with people when they discover how complex it is and how deep. Then lots of people got amazed and just can't stop thinking about wine after that moment. So back to the founding of your first business. What motivated you to start it? Why did you feel the need to quit the job and try to build your own empire?
Oh, I think part of it is just having an entrepreneurial spirit. I wanted to own my own business. I thought there was the potential to actually make some money, potential to actually do something that I enjoy. And this was a very, very much a dinosaur model of retail business. This is four walls, brick and mortar, knowing virtually everyone who walks in the door. You hand sell wines, you tell the story. It's a very personal, sort of hands-on type of business, which is the longest, slowest build, but it also builds amazing loyalty. And so I had this business for nearly 20 years, and the early years were extremely tough. Part of it is not having the experience and making mistakes that a more experienced person could avoid. But it's also just, excuse me, it's also about staying consistent and engaging with the people that are your base, and then gradually growing that. It's a long, slow build. So the business was tremendous. I'm thrilled that I had it for as long as I did, and I ended up selling it the year that I became a master of wine.
Yeah, I read it, and it's very interesting for me. The fact that you sold it and the fact that you sold it in that exact moment. What was the reason for selling it, and why then?
Well, actually, it's a little bit of dumb luck. I ended up selling the business in early 2002. So it was just after 9/11, when much of the activity in the world had ceased. And my plan going into 2002, I'm going to put this business up for sale with the hope that I would finally get my way through the Master of Wine program that year. I was very close. And my thought was, this will be my stepping stone to a whole nother career within the wine business. So And also with this business, with the retail business, for anyone who has been in that space, especially when you're a small business and you're involved in every aspect, it's nights, weekends, holidays, you're not feeling well, you have family visiting, it doesn't matter, you're working. And even though the business was profitable, it was growing, my thought was, do I really want to do this for the rest of my working life? No, I want to do something that has a broader reach. So my plan was to put the business up for sale in early 2002. 9/11 happened, everything stopped, and just through, I'm going to call it dumb luck, I had an individual who came into my business who was looking to buy a business because he had a capital gains issue. He needed to invest in a business. It could have been a wine store, a shoe store. It ended up,
I see.
he bought my business. That was my ticket.
Wow, that's very interesting. Yeah, about the small stores, I can imagine that it was quite stressful, and I can imagine that also it's very tough to scale such a business. And
It
to
is. Yeah,
yeah,
it is, because you are the business.
exactly. And if you built it, I can imagine, knowing you from YouTube and from all the content that you produce, you have these stories and you can explain the wines and bring attention. I can imagine that even in the store, you are the person who brought in the customers and you were the main guy. I think it would have been hard to replace you by just hiring a person.
Well, perhaps. But again, for me, it was looking at the wine world and all of the different elements that I hadn't really fully connected with. And that intrigued me. I thought, okay, I need to do something more that'll involve more travel and something where perhaps there would be this corporate element. So
Okay.
there would still be this retail aspect, but in a very different manner.
Yeah, so your goal was to find like a corporate job doing like in the wine business doing bigger things.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
I see. So you started doing that exactly in the moment when you finished the Master of Wine exam. How was your Master of Wine process and the whole examination and studying?
So for anyone who goes through the process, they'll have a bit of a different story.
Yeah.
And for me, the way I became involved in it, my now ex-wife, and she's not my ex because of the MW program, but she found an article in some magazine, and it's when the Master of Wine program was starting to have much more of an international reach. You know, up to that point, it had been heavily focused in the UK. And she saw this article and she said, you know, I think this could be very interesting for you. And I didn't know much about it, only I vaguely had some knowledge of the name, but what it meant, didn't really know. Did a bit of research, and I thought this grabs my interest for a number of reasons. For one, it'll help me to really expand my knowledge base. I thought it would also give me a network of people that could be advantageous. And also, I thought this could be a great way to take the career to some other aspect. So that's really my motivation to get started. When I entered the program, I had a successful business for a number of years, but it's an old saying, but it was a little bit like I was the big fish in a very little pond. And now getting into the MW program, it's a very different experience. For me, there were times in the MW program, it was quite humbling. Of course, there's always setbacks. But But I think there was a time not too far into the program, I realized that the setbacks were actually motivation to continue on, because I felt like I was progressing, and
Of course.
and after a while, it almost became an obsession, and it was one of these experiences where, in my case, I had a successful business. And there are some things that I just held near and dear as being true. And sometimes you discover that
Mm,
you're wrong. The most difficult aspect was actually taking concepts that you thought were spot on correct, and you realize, well, there's always exceptions.
yeah.
And for me, that meant, okay, you're starting to have more of a broader lateral view of the wine world, which I thought was kind of cool.
Do you remember any examples of these things that you thought was some way and you discovered that you were wrong? Because I also have this like feeling in the university that I learned some things that I was pretty sure that was like different from books, and I this is a reoccurring feeling in the wine industry that there are
Yeah.
a lot of exceptions. Do you remember such examples?
I mean, one that comes to mind from the tasting side, the practical side of the exam. I had this mental image of what to expect from various left bank appellations. Okay, so in
Okay.
my mind, this was Santa Steph, this was Margaux, and so on. I was wrong. Again, when you paint with a very broad brush,
Yeah.
you're bound to make a mistake. And in order to help alleviate that sort of situation, what I found on the tasting side, the practical side, there was a need to focus heavily on classic regions. So
Okay.
Bordeaux, Burgundy, Tuscany, Piemonte, so on. For me, that was a good foundational base. And it also dovetailed back to the very early days when I was just getting engaged in wine, when I worked with this older gentleman. So it really came together very well. And for anyone who is looking to get into an advanced program like the MW, my suggestion is focus heavily on the classic regions.
I see, and I think this is true. Not just not even just for the wine industry or wine studies, but in any field, you should start with the bigger theories, and then start and try to understand the details. But I think your setup was the perfect. You had this beginning with the interest in the wine industry. Now you are working in the your own wine shop, so you were surrounded with wine. So I can imagine that for the tasting exercise, you had all the wines around you, and
Absolutely.
that was the
Yeah.
perfect setup. And as you mentioned with the setbacks, I think this is the optimal challenge for any person in any field. When you have such a big challenge that you have the setbacks, but you can see some progress, that's when a person can really focus and go deep. Because if it's too easy, then you lose interest, and if it's impossible, then the other end. But this is the exact way when a person catches on.
Yeah,
So
I
yeah,
agree.
that. What do you have any strategies when you were exercising for the tasting exam? Because every person has a different way of exercising and training for this.
You're right. Everyone has their own approach. For me, I lived at this time, I lived in northern Michigan. So very isolated from groups of other students. I think the nearest students to me, I think, were Chicago, which was maybe a 6-hour drive away. I didn't have a study group because of that, or at least to a large extent, I did not. I focused on those classic regions, and I tried to taste under exam conditions as much as possible.
Okay.
So I would do the time tastings. I would do all the, well, now you can use a laptop, but back in my day, everything was handwritten. So I practiced that time and time again. And it was to the point where it almost became like muscle memory. If I thought, okay, I have 12 wines and I have 2 hours to make the assessment, gives me 10 minutes per wine. I'm going to spend maybe 3 minutes giving this wine the analysis, taking some quick shorthand notes, and about 7 minutes to actually write up all my comments. And after a while, it just becomes ingrained. So I'm not even looking at a clock saying, okay, 10 minutes, I need to move on. You just inherently know it. That helps, because at that point, the mechanics of the tasting become almost secondhand. It gives you the ability to focus solely on what's in the glass and answer the question as it's set.
Okay, so does it have like specific questions, or you just have to describe the wine to the details as deep as you can?
No, there's specific questions, and it'll vary. It'll vary. You never know what the questions can be. But on the tasting, you might get questions. Typically, it's a number of questions, but it may be grape variety or varieties, place of origin, vintage, market position, influence of weather. There's a whole series of questions. And when you're answering these questions, it's not just a matter of listing a grape variety on the page. It's explaining why it is what you think it is. So it's a lot of detail work in terms of how you got from the start to your conclusion.
I see. I'm not sure if this makes it more difficult or a little bit easier, because if you have the opportunity to explain your reasoning, maybe you didn't catch the exact grape variety, but or the exact region or specific sub-region, but if your reasoning is correct, I can imagine that you still receive some points, and maybe while explaining it, it can help you as well.
It's not a parlor game. It's not like you walk into a bar and someone gives you a glass. Hey, what is this? I mean, you're tasting in almost like a clinical sort of environment, and you're focused solely on what's in that glass. And if the question pertains to a place of origin, when you're thinking it through, let's say you maybe the place of origin, it's taking you to a place like Marlborough, let's say. There are certain markers that'll be characteristic from that place. So you're looking at the acidity, the alcohol level. I mean, these are markers that'll lead you to a specific place and away from others. And as you start to work through this, for each one of those questions, it tells a bit of the story. So as you're progressing through, eventually at some point you'll take a leap of faith and you'll say, this is what I feel it is, and you've substantiated why or how you got there. Now, you could be flat out wrong. It doesn't mean you're not getting any points. There could be some of the points that you've discussed could apply to a few different regions around the world. So it's not about actually guessing exactly what the wine is. It would be great if you did, but it's more of the thought process of how you started to the conclusion. Does that make sense?
I see. Exactly. It makes a lot of sense. And before I discovered this fact that actually the point is not to name the exact wine, and I think a lot of people have this belief that there was this legend, and everybody said that the Master of Wine exam is when you have to say the exact, even the winery, the vintage, everything. And if it's not the correct version, then you fail. But this way, it's a lot more logical.
Yeah, it's not a matter of hitting the wine spot on. But I will say, there's a term that's used commonly is bankers. So oftentimes there can be wines that are just spot on example. I mean, for me, I remember sitting the exam, and one of the wines that just ticked that box immediately was a Moscato d'Asti. Okay.
Yeah.
You have a tiny bit of CO2. The alcohol level is low. The residual sugar is elevated. It's all primary fruit. Tick, tick, tick. What else can this be? So, there are examples like that. Most of the time, everything starts to get very convoluted. And if you go down a path where you start to second guess, maybe you panic, you got a little sweat on your brow, okay, come on back, because you're going off the rails. And I think a lot of that just comes through repetition. And for me, when I actually went through the tasting side of it, I had a grid in my mind, and that grid was something that I used, and it was just muscle memory. But for red wines, for instance, I'm looking at the color density, alcohol, oak, tannin, acidity, all of those markers that really make up the structure of that wine. I'm not talking so much about sometimes you get the romanticized language where someone's getting into black fruits and cassis and graphite and cedar. That's important. But the foundational piece for me was really what I used as a compass.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So you had this framework that you followed. It's like I can imagine that it's even like different from general wine tasting. When you just enjoy a wine, you don't really start to follow this framework. But for such occasions, as you said, it's a very clinical environment. I think this can help to prevent the confusion and going into losing yourself in the wine regions.
I think it helps if you look at it in terms of, I need to approach this in a way that I can replicate. So this way you go through the same sort of process again and again. But your comment, you touched on something as I really was going deep into this blind tasting exercise, and as the exam was coming, I've got to say there was a time I could not stand having another glass of wine. It's like this has become a labor. And it's like, you work in a candy store all day, and it's like, okay, you can only eat so much candy. It's a little bit of the same.
Exactly. Especially blind tasting is very challenging, and you get tired. All the thinking and trying to discover this, it's like a crime scene, trying to put up the pieces together.
I've not heard that before, but it is a bit like a crime scene.
Yeah, it's a puzzle.
The only thing is, in this case, it's 36 crime scenes in the 3 days.
Yeah, so you have to be very, very proficient detective. But I totally understand that after a lot of blind tastings, probably you didn't want another glass of wine with your dinner.
But now it's there's still an element of this that plays out today where I could be anywhere, in a restaurant or somewhere, and I have a glass of wine. It's just innate. These check marks just come to mind, and I'm thinking, and it's almost at times it's a bit of a curse. It's like, just enjoy it for what it is.
Yeah. I see. But on the other hand, I think if you know about wines, and if you studied and you have knowledge, it also increases the enjoyment, or the pleasure that you get from wine, because it's not just a drink as it was for you at the beginning, but when tasting it, you realize all the background, all the work that went into the wine. Maybe you remember that wine region if you visited it. So it's a lot richer experience when you have all this knowledge.
No, I agree. For me, I think a good comparison is music. I love it. All sorts of music. I don't play a musical instrument. I can't read music. I mean, I can only go so deep. For me, I get personal enjoyment out of it. I know there's much more there. There's much more nuance and layer, but it's not part of my world, and I really don't grasp it. So I think with wine, you can have a tremendous amount of enjoyment without being some wine geek. That's not part of the criteria. It just depends on your personal preference.
Of course. But nowadays there are lots of as you are lots of very interesting wine educational content creators on YouTube and Instagram and everywhere. And I think this can really help the consumers to understand it a little bit more and maybe have more meaningful experiences tasting wine.
Yeah, agreed. I agree.
So back to your story. You sold your business, started a corporate job. What was that job, and how did you start?
So I had a number of corporate jobs over nearly 20 years. And I had worked for the behemoth for a number of years. I worked for Walmart for about 5 years. I worked for a huge grocery chain in the southeast part of the U.S. called Southeastern Grocers, about 1,000 grocery stores. I made a move to the West Coast. There was a specialty retail business there called Bevmo, which is all along the West Coast. And, excuse me, then my final corporate role was in Australia. I worked in Melbourne for a company called Coles. And all of these huge companies, massive volumes of wine. In many cases, you're talking more commodity type of wines. Yeah. And for me, that was a whole different aspect of the wine business. I mean, when I had my store, it was all about hand selling wines that were very artisanal. They were mostly small family operations. They had a good story.
Yeah.
I moved into another part of the world where, okay, it's all about looking at a spreadsheet and moving volume and hitting margin targets. I spent years creating private label wines. And, in some parts of the world, that's very advanced. In the UK, for instance, private label has been a foundational piece in that wine world for years. In the U.S., not so much. It is now. It's really progressed. But back in the early days when I was involved in it, it was a small part of the business. So
what is private label wine?
It's essentially where you create a new brand through a contract with a supplier. So it's done in this very analytical means. I would look at a business, and again, we're talking, moving hundreds of millions of dollars in wine. There are opportunities within your assortment where, let's say, and this plays in the wine very well because wine is an extremely fragmented business.
Yeah.
There's 1 million plus brands out there. If any of those brands disappeared today, I mean, the real story is no one would care. It's not like someone has critical mass. Even big players like Gallo, for instance, they don't have critical mass. But what I would do is I would find opportunities within the assortment, and now I'd go out and find myself a supplier partner that could meet the quality, the volume, price stability. They would hit a specific style that I want. Perhaps the private label would be styled exactly after an existing brand. And so if you do this correctly as a large retailer, it certainly does help to drive loyalty. If someone buys your private label, they can't get it anywhere else. So hopefully they come back. It's also a margin driver. You generally work on higher profit margins than branded items, which have a lot of competition. And the other thing is, it really does help as a leverage point against those big brand holders. Okay, I have a viable option. I can put more emphasis on that. I'm asking you to sharpen a price or give me something that you're not willing to give. You have leverage points. And it really just becomes business negotiation at that point. I did this for years.
Wow. So these opportunities that you are looking for are like wine styles or price categories or maybe a combination in
It
the
could be,
store?
yeah, it could be any of those. It might be, I may be looking at a business and saying, okay, we have a Spanish business that's increasing. Okay, where is it increasing? It's increasing in a $10 to $15 retail price, heavy emphasis on two regions. It's Rioja and Ribera del Duero. Okay, because it's very fragmented. Oftentimes, a retailer can create a private label, and as a consumer, the consumer may not even know it's private label. They just say, "Oh, here's a Rioja that I hadn't seen before. Cool, I want to try that."
Hmm.
So those are the types of things that I look for. And the wine world changes. Back many years ago, some of the very early private label programs that I worked on were Moscato based. It had that spike in
Yeah.
interest a couple of decades ago. Sometime after that, it was Malbec from Argentina. This is red hot. This is another one
Yeah.
you can look at. When Rosé made a comeback, again, that's an opportunity. So it's not stagnant. It's always changing.
Yeah, that must be very exciting. So this was the main part of your job, building these private labels, or
That was a significant part. Yeah. Because what it did is the more that you could grow that private label business, for the company itself, if they own the brands, it becomes equity for the company. So it has that value. But also, it was something that drove margin. It helped to differentiate. It provided value in other places as well. This is the cornerstone of many large retailers around the world today.
yeah.
In the US, back 20 years ago, not so much, but it is a heavy, heavy focus today. And there's some retailers in the US where the foundation of their business is private label or control label. And the difference being with private label, that is, you've created something from concept to completion. Okay. A control label would be one where you may have an exclusive in this specific market. In a different market, someone else would have an exclusive. So in effect, it's the same result, but the mechanics is a bit different.
I see.
But in the US, for instance, take a retailer like Total Wine. Huge retailer, multiple states, growing, fantastic following. Much of their business is based on private and control labels. And again, it's if you can do this in a way where it resonates with your customers, it's a great way to differentiate yourself. It makes you a very unique shopping destination.
Wow, that's very interesting. And I think this is so when you were building these private labels, you were contacting and keeping in touch with the producers, with wineries.
Yeah, so what would happen is this. Oh, and I should mention, private label business in its very embryonic stage was used as a point of entry. I mean, the example that I heard, it's kind of ridiculous, but it certainly does drive the point. Years ago, I can't afford a bottle of Veuve Clicquot, but I can afford that knockoff that has that yellow label. That's in the most simplistic. Now private label stretches vertically in price point from opening price point to ultra premium. So there is a whole wide range. But back to your question, what would happen is this. If I was looking for a Ribera del Duero, for instance, I would do some research and perhaps I would come up with half a dozen potential suppliers. These are producers that have volume. Perhaps they're already playing in this private label space. I would reach out to maybe half a dozen. And it's a vetting process. Let me gauge your level of interest. Do you have stocks that could be available? What sort of input can I have on the wine? Can I hit a price point? Is the price point stable? How does it compare to the competitive set? So we'll do blind tastings versus those other branded wines from that region. And sometimes when you're creating these labels, you're creating a fictitious label. You think, okay, the target audience is a 40 to 50, 55-year-old male consumer. Put together a focus group of those individuals. That packaging, does it resonate? So, there's a lot of due diligence behind the scenes. And ultimately, you end up partnering up with someone who you feel ticks all the right boxes.
That's very interesting and very scientific way of choosing. So sometimes you even have input on maybe winemaking technologies or the way that the wine is produced.
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes. For instance, maybe my input would be putting together a final blend, or maybe I'd work with the winemaker and say, okay, we're trying to benchmark it off of this other brand. I need something that has more of a lifted fruit component to it. Okay. And, so there is some of that. Excuse me. I don't want to make this sound like, it's, in many cases, put it this way, the winemaker, the winemaking team, they're the subject matter experts. And, they have the capability to understand, what they can produce. I can maybe nudge things in certain directions to say, here are trends that I'm seeing in the market. Let's try to kind of follow that versus deviate from it.
Well, at this point, you already almost became a winemaker.
So look, I've never been a winemaker, but I am involved in a number of consulting projects where I put together final blends in wineries, and I do have input on what ultimately ends up going in the bottle. But no, I'm not a winemaker, and actually never had an interest.
Really? That's interesting. You mentioned that nowadays these private labels have a huge range from entry-level wines even to ultra-premium. That's surprising to me. Are there ultra-premium private labels? Because I can imagine for these private labels you need quite a huge volume, because these shops, these merchants have lots of places they need volume. And for ultra premium wines, there are not a lot of wineries that can do that in great volume.
Yeah. So with that, if you're looking at a large retailer, they'd say they're in hundreds of locations or more. Most of the time with these large retailers, they go through a process called clustering, and it's looking at the demographics of your stores. So there could be stores that are higher income. There could be maybe a specific ethnicity, an age range. Some of these will have impact on wine buying decisions. So, for instance, if you were looking at something more at the very premium side, and the production of it was very limited, well, it can be targeted just to those specific stores that fit the definition of what the ideal customer should be. And it really provides two benefits. One is you're funneling those wines to areas where they make the most sense. And the other side of it is you don't want to send high-end expensive wines to locations that it doesn't fit, because eventually that ends up being a liability.
Of course.
So, it's looked at in you may have a huge company, but it's generally segmented. And that segmentation takes you down a path to hopefully get things right from the beginning and not make errors.
Well, I didn't think about that it can be targeted in such a way, but it makes total sense. And what about the side of the winery? Because if you are already producing ultra premium wines, most of the wineries go with the other way to build their own brand. Why do they choose this path?
Well, look, there's a number of producers where they can sell everything that they produce, and it's under their own labels. Sure. Like the wine world is huge, and there's areas where look at what's happening in Bordeaux today, for instance. You have massive amounts of vineyards that are being pulled up. The number of chateaus continues to decrease. There's some consolidation there, but there is a tremendous amount of volume that doesn't have a home.
Yeah.
So, areas like that, there's always going to be opportunities. Look in Spain with Rioja, for instance. The production levels there are currently surpassing what the demand is.
Yeah.
So, there's areas where there's opportunities. Now, if it's someone who is producing, some very top-end Barolo, for instance, no, they're not going to play in this private label space. But for some business models, it makes sense, and it's a viable option.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned that you saw all these trends in the wine industry, the Moscatos, with the Rosés, with the Malbecs. You, with such an experience, what do you see as potential trends in the future, or some trends that are already starting nowadays?
Okay, so my feeling is something that has fantastic potential going forward. I'm going to call these alternative grape varieties. And sometimes people will call these indigenous grape varieties, but I think alternative is probably a better way to describe it. But again, if you look at the indigenous side of it, I think of some of the grape varieties that are making comebacks in Italy, for instance. The plantings of something like Pecorino or Fiano. I mean, these are grape varieties that are starting to create more of an interest. And I think part of this is it really touches more on broader consumer buying habits. If you're buying meat or coffee or tea, cheese, oftentimes people are looking for the story that ties it back to a place. What makes it unique and different, and hopefully you create some sort of emotive link. I think the same is happening with wine. It's more of, what's the unique, different story? And oftentimes that ties back to a place. When I lived in Australia, I was surprised at the amount of the range of grape varieties. And again, I say like Fiano or Nero d'Avola. I couldn't believe the amount of Tempranillo that was grown in Australia. They all have this, interesting story, and it's not more of the same. It's not like the commodity viewpoint of the wine world. It's a little more unique, and when you create that emotive link, that's a big win.
Yeah, that is very logical. But why do you think it happens now? Why didn't the consumers start to have these preferences before? Why is it blowing up now?
I think there's a number of reasons. I think it ties to trends in a lot of food products. People have instant access to information, which 25, 30 years ago you didn't have. It's hard to flip on the TV and not find some sort of travel show or something, cooking that ties back to a specific place of origin. Yeah. So the access to information is there. Post-COVID, people are back on planes and traveling. So I think there's a lot of reasons of why this is happening. And for wine specifically, Look, I think wine is a lot about adventure, and it's trying something new and different, and always exploring. It's almost endless. The
Yeah,
options are there, and I think as people start to get a little more familiar, comfortable with what they're drinking, and they're experiencing all of these other regions, it's just a natural progression.
well, this I think it can be a healthy trend for the wine industry, because this can help smaller wine regions and smaller wineries if they have these indigenous or alternative grape varieties. What do you think the industry's reaction is going to be? Because I can imagine that if this trend really grows, that the large wineries are going to start to plant some smaller plots and have like 15 different grape varieties to catch on this trend. Or how do you see it? What is going to happen?
Well, that's already happening. But there is also another driver to this, and that is some of these indigenous grape varieties. They're very well suited to some of the effects that are happening with climate change.
Mm.
Okay, I use the Fiano example, for instance. Fiano is a grape variety that can get ripeness that can give you 14% alcohol.
Yeah.
The acidity does not collapse at that point. So it's something that can be grown in warm areas, and you can still have that very lifted acidity. So I think that climate change piece of it is certainly weighing into the factor as well.
Of course, of course. And I think in this industry change in Europe, this over regulation is going to probably protect a little bit the regions against these replantings, because it is in most of the regions it's prohibited, lots of grape varieties and very limited. But the New World in the US and all over the New World, they can almost everywhere plant anything. So
But look at what's happening in Bordeaux. There's a number of new grape varieties, and we'll see where this goes. But even in these classic regions, there is this, in many cases, there is this acknowledgement that we can't stay the way we are, because the world is changing and we cannot remain stagnant. I think this story is something that'll go on for certainly all the rest of my days and beyond. I mean, it's a story that's in its very early stage, but there's no doubt there'll be plenty of changes.
of course, of course. I also think that even these tough regulations are going to change in a short time, because it's very, in a lot of places it's very counterproductive, because in some cases it makes sense to protect a DOC or a region's name, but in most of the cases it just limits the creativity.
Yeah, it's the same. It's a story that plays out time and time again.
Yeah. So at one point you moved to Australia. How was that, and why did you decide to do it? What kind of job?
I loved it there. Loved it. So I had the opportunity just to be there on a 2-year work visa. And
Okay.
I lived in downtown Melbourne. I worked for a company called Coles, huge outfit, something like 900 stores around the country. I mean, massive beverage alcohol business, which wine was a significant part of it. And I was there. I headed up the private label and what are called exclusive brands.
Yep.
And in some places in the world, excuse me, in Australia, for instance, you can have a branded wine that could be an exclusive to a retailer. You'll find this in the UK and number of other places. In the US, you don't see that. If it's a brand that is available broadly, like let's say Kendall Jackson, for instance, there is no one that has an exclusive on it. It's in multiple outlets and multiple businesses. So I headed up that business in Australia for 2 years. Love Australia, love the people. The quality of life is fantastic. The food culture, absolutely love it. have a lot of good friends there. The wine scene, it's an interesting place. You have this, it's really spread from coast to coast, mostly more along the southern border of the country. But you can get quite inland as well. In Victoria, you get into a place like Rutherglen. But I think Australia has an amazing range of wines that are broadly not recognized in many places around the world. Certainly in the U.S., it doesn't have the presence that it really deserves.
So Australian wines.
Australian wines in the U.S., it's been a down market for a couple of decades. And it's a shame. Some of that business has been taken from South America, some of it from California itself, but certainly from Chile and Argentina. Within Australia, look, you have 25 million people thereabouts. And Australian wine is primarily what they drink. On the export markets, I spent a fair amount of time in some Southeastern Asian countries. Australia has a very good presence there. It's France and then Australia, those two really neck and neck. But I think Australia has a great story, fantastic value. And the interesting thing that's changing there, for years, they had a significant export market to China. Well, there were some tariffs, there were some disagreements. That has just been removed. So all of the limitations that Australia had getting into that Chinese market, it's essentially been lifted. So I think there's a brighter day for the Australian wine producers. I would hope that just the rest of the wine drinking world would more fully recognize and appreciate what you can find in places like Barossa and Coonawarra, Margaret River, Clare, Tasmania is amazing. The
That's
stories,
very interesting.
Stories are there, but it just doesn't get the attention that it deserves.
I think it's a very limited attention. People only see a few styles from Australia, the Barossa, Shiraz, and a few styles, but it's not so broad.
No, I agree. It's a lot of the same wines over and over. There's a few companies that are very large and they dominate a good amount of the exports. But when you get into the family-owned, artisanal, the stories are amazing. And there's plenty of these. So yeah, if you're looking for wines that have a good story, and you're not paying much attention to Australia, it's a treasure trove. It's just there's a lot there to be found.
Yeah, that's a great advice. I think another reason for this not being so understood or not so popular is the location. It's very far from everywhere, and probably the transportation costs and everything, it makes it more difficult. And especially for the smaller wineries who have a small volume, it is tough just based on the location to reach the port because it's far from everywhere.
Absolutely, that's definitely part of it.
But this China thing can be really a great opportunity because the Chinese wine consumption is growing and the Chinese imports. So I mean their production is also growing. So we'll see how the Chinese market is going to evolve. What do you think about that? Because it's a very hot topic, the Chinese wine market.
So I worked in the Chinese market for 2 years. When I was in Australia, my responsibility was also exporting wine to China. This was prior to the tariffs coming into play. So I made routine trips there. I think there's a good number of retailers there that are really quite advanced. It's interesting working with the buying teams there. They did their homework. When they came into meetings, they had lots of questions and they just seemed to almost soak that in. So I think the learning curve is really quite sharp. One of the concerning areas that I see in that market, I mean, first you have more of an evolving class of people that see wine as it's a prestige item. It's something that it like elevates the lifestyle, so it has that appeal to it. And that segment of the population is really quite significant. But the concerning part of it is the amount of counterfeit wine. It's mind-blowing. And so you really need to be aware of what you're buying. If you're a consumer there, there's the possibility that counterfeit can become a problem. I don't know how that's actually fixed, but yeah, there was a high degree of counterfeit wine, and a lot of this is at the very high level.
Of course, that's when it's worth it for the criminals.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, the counterfeit market is a very tough challenge, and we talked about this with Perry, the wine lobbyist, and we concluded that there is no good solution, unfortunately, preventing this or like stopping the counterfeit market. The only thing that we can do to buy from renowned sellers or places that are trusted.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some basic safeguards that can be put into play. It's not 100% guarantee.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's always fraught with some risk.
Of course. But still, the Chinese market is very interesting and a new and unpredictable situation. It's a interesting match because it wasn't really a product in the Chinese culture just in the last few decades. Blew up, and it's a very interesting tendency and all the trends. And now, actually, I never tasted the Chinese wine, but I read more and more articles about the Chinese red wines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, China is producing more and more wine itself. France is the area that has all the prestige. So, classic regions from France, Bordeaux, Burgundy, so on. In most Asian markets, it's primarily red wine. I would say, I don't know this as fact, but it wouldn't surprise me if 90% of the wine consumed is red.
What do you think? What is the reason for this? Maybe a culinary connection, or what is the?
I can't speak on this with a whole lot of insight, other than I think it does tie to the perception of red wine having more character, more depth, more value. I think there's that aspect of it. Look, a lot of the spirits consumed in China are white spirits, high alcohol type of.
Yeah.
There may be some sort of connection. That's white wine just has that more of and a little bit more maybe of a downscale image to it. But I think a lot of it has to do with the classic regions like Bordeaux. Bordeaux being 85-90% red wine, all the iconic estates with a few exceptions, tie back to red wine production. I think there's a long history of that.
Interesting. What are your preferences, favorite wines or wine styles?
Okay, so I probably do not drink the same wine twice over the course of a year. I really mix it up for a few reasons. One is I like to taste very, very broadly. I do some work for a magazine. I review some wines. I write some articles. So they're always sending me a broad range of things to try. But if I had to tie back to a region that I drink more than anything, it would be the Southern Rhone. I've been a huge fan of Grenache base, also Syrah, Mourvedre, that sort of thing. But Grenache-based wines from the Southern Rhone, I think, have been some of the best values for many, many decades. Some of them now are really nudging up there. But I think there's still some nice examples to be found. So I drink a fair amount of red wines from that part of the world. And for whites, I'd say I probably drink 2/3 red to 1/3 white.
Okay.
With the whites, what I found is the older I get, I'm looking for less oak. I want wines with brighter acidity, fresher, brighter, cleaner primary fruit. I love the wines from Loire,
Okay.
and Syrah, Manitou Salon, Pouilly-Fumé, that sort of thing. Absolutely love the wines from Alto Adige up in that northeast part of Italy. And but no, I really mix it up. Oh, and sparkling. Can never get enough sparkling.
Yeah, that's very. We are all the same with that. What do you think about Hungarian wines? Do you have experience with the Hungarian regions?
I do some. It's not something that I see a lot of. And quite honestly, when I do taste Hungarian wines, it's usually at some sort of trade event, some sort of wine industry event. So, mostly what I'll see and what I'll drink, and I know this is a small segment, but the sweet wines, the Tokaizu, that kind of thing. I think those are some of the most amazing long-lived wines. But Hungary is something that it's not. It's more on the periphery for what I see.
Yeah, and that's especially in the US. In Europe, in European countries, it's more available, but due to the volume and this image of only Tokaj, lots of people only know the Tokaj wine region and the sweet wines. I think it's a little bit limiting, but I see some changes, and I also try to work on this and increase the.
What do you see as the future for Hungarian wine?
I see quite a few potential regions. The southern part of Hungary, Villány, for example, there the red wines, some very very interesting spicy red potential. The Kadarka grape variety, the Hungarian red grape variety, also has great potential. I also really like, this is one of my main preferences, dry white wines from the Tokaj region, so the dry Furmins. I think those also have good potential. There are some sparkling wines also in Hungary and in the historical Hungarian regions, like in Transylvania. There is now a great sparkling wine producer, like Traditional Method Sparklings. So there are good projects, and I really believe in those.
I think with some of what's happening in other places in the world, with these indigenous grape varieties, these grape varieties that have a strong sense of place, it should play to Hungary's advantage. But I think it's also a matter of, that messaging. For instance, in the U.S. in recent years, I suppose this is through some conscious effort, seeing more Georgian wines than ever. And, they're doing trade events. The wines are everywhere. And for an average interested wine consumer, it's very confusing. It's really hard to decipher what it is. And then you get into amber wines and all these different styles and so on. I think that outreach program of, creating an identity of who you are and what sets you apart, for any country looking to develop that sort of business, they need to have a story that makes them unique. And it needs to be a story that people can understand with relative ease.
Yeah, that makes sense. What do you think? What you mentioned that it's very hard to understand the Georgian wines for the general consumer. What do you refer there? What do you refer to there? The great name of grape varieties or regions, or
Well, both. I think it's grape varieties and regions. And there's also, as I mentioned, there's a heavy play on, what oftentimes would be called orange wines. They'll refer to them as amber.
Yeah.
The production methods are really quite unique. It's a great story. There's a lot of history there. But it's also something that I think is very out of the box for a lot of people. So,
Yeah.
there's layers and layers of barriers that, for a country that's trying to develop their export market, for me, I think it needs to be something where the message is consistent, it's easier to understand, and it's conveyed in a way that is, I don't want to say simplistic, but it needs to be something that can be understood without looking at this saying, oh my God, I need to do research on this and I need to dig into every little aspect.
Yeah.
Your audience becomes smaller and smaller when the point of entry becomes much more difficult. So, yeah.
That is a great advice. So would you suggest for example, for the Hungarian wine industry to use the indigenous grape varieties, but maybe select a few of them as the flagship?
I think that piece of it, there should definitely be a couple that are, this defines who we are. And, you see this a little bit in other places around the world. I mean, to varying degrees of success. But, think of, South Africa, for instance, with Pinotage. Okay, when you think of Pinotage, if you're somebody who's in the wine, well, it takes me back to that place.
Exactly.
I mean, to some degree, you could even say that about Malbec. Even though it does have global reach and classic origins in France, for most consumers, you say Malbec, oh, Argentina. Maybe to a lesser degree, Carmenere in Chile. But, there's these grape varieties that tie to a region and it become almost signature grape varieties. Some of these are not hugely popular, but it does help to create the identity.
Of course. And even the fact that these grape varieties, the Carmenere in Chile, it's not an indigenous grape variety. So the story there is
Correct.
even more like manufactured. But for these countries that have their own grape varieties, it should be easier.
Absolutely. When there is a historical place of origin, I mean, yes, the story is much deeper. The others that I mentioned, these are all grape varieties that have been brought in, but they've been embraced and the story has been built around them, and they've really helped to create identities for these countries.
Yeah. Except Pinotage. I think Pinotage was created in South Africa, right?
Yeah. It's a cross of Cinsault and Pinot Noir. Yeah. And look, there's a lot of god awful examples of Pinotage. You had decades there where you had heavily diseased material that just made lousy wine. I think there's some better examples out there today. But for me, being the old guy that I am, I think back to examples from decades ago and think, God, I mean, the wines, it's rare that I've had wines that immediately remind me of iodine. And the old examples of Pinotage. So
probably this bad image from the beginning of the Pinotage story created this situation where it is like only produced in South Africa.
Yeah, very, very little outside of the country.
Yeah, very.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. You mentioned a few minutes ago that one of your favorite red wines are from the Rhone region and Grenache. I wanted to ask you, I saw the video a year ago when you got your tattoo and you selected, you have the Grenache on the top and the Syrah on the bottom.
Yep.
So why did you choose those exact two grape varieties? And why two different grapes on your arm?
Well, I did not expect you to bring that up. Look, they've been wines or grape varieties that I've been drawn to for decades. And some of them, for me, some of the most interesting wines that I've had have been from either one or both of those grape varieties. And so for me, it really had this, it meant something in terms of you've drank these wines over nearly 40 years, and they've been some of the most persuasive wines that you've drank over that time. And I think they're amazing grape varieties. I think Grenache is something that, look, the styles of it are very broad, and it can manifest itself in many different ways. You have Blanc and Gris and Rouge, and you have different versions like that. Many places around the world have ancient vineyards of Grenache. Certainly you'll find that in the Southern Rhone. You mentioned Australia. I mean, there's 100-plus-year-old vineyards of Grenache. And for me, they're amazing wines. Many times they are just not fully appreciated because there's a good amount of Grenache is made at a very basic commercial level. And the wines are nothing special. But when it gets the deluxe treatment, I think it can produce amazing wines, especially older vineyards with low yields. And it's a bit like that with Syrah as well. And Syrah in many places around the world today, it's very much a down market. Certainly in the U.S., if you're planting Syrah, I think you're going to have a tough go. There's not a huge market for it. But yeah, that's the story. And I ended up getting this on a trip to Kuala Lumpur, a place that I go to quite often. I'm going back there in a few weeks. And I need to come up with something for this arm. So that
maybe some white grape varieties. Do they have white ink?
Well, you notice with this, there's no red ink. I wanted it just all black. And and my thought is, look, I'm kind of an older guy, and since I'm going to have this forever, maybe 20 years from now, if I'm still around, the grapes will look a little shriveled. That's okay.
You should have tattooed some Furmins or some Semillons, and then when they shrivel, it could have been a...
Here you go. You need to send me some ideas, because here I have a blank palette to work with.
Great. At the end, I think we should talk about a little bit about your YouTube ventures. You started your YouTube channel like a year ago, right?
Just over a year ago. I had thought about it for years, and through work and through coming up with 100 different excuses of why not to do it, I thought, okay, I think this is a space that could be interesting. I'm a little bit of the old dog trying to learn a new trick, so there's a lot to learn in this space. YouTube's confusing. You look at the algorithm and search engine optimization and all the moving pieces. There's a lot there to make sense of. But my feeling was this: I thought there's space there, and I looked at doing this about 4 years ago initially. And for about 4 years ago, I had COVID, and I was quite sick. I was down for a good part of 2020. Okay, so the plans for YouTube are delayed. And as I mentioned, I come up with all these excuses of why I need to delay doing this. Well, I finally got off my ass on late 2022 and thought, okay, it's time to do this. Steep learning curve. Certainly, I think the videos, I believe they've gotten better, and I believe they will progressively get better. But it's been a great experience. I've connected with tremendous people all around the world. People have been extremely supportive. I try to view it a little bit like my old retail business. If someone posts a question, they have a comment, I try to follow up with everyone. Sometimes it turns into a dialogue back and forth.
That's how we met. And that's how this
Yeah,
podcast.
exactly. Yeah. And I think that personal aspect, I think people really like. I want the channel to be very pure in that what is on the videos are my own opinion. They're sincere. It's not something that's sometimes in YouTube, and this could be on any type of channel, cooking, travel, whatever. I think oftentimes these channels become infomercials. They're messages that are delivered that are very scripted.
Yeah.
I want the polar opposite of that. I want things to be more free flowing and just be what they are. So the opinions that I give are my own. With wine, someone could disagree with me. There is no right or wrong.
Of course.
But yeah, it's been a great experience. Most of the people that subscribe, and right now I'm just a little bit shy of 10,000 subscribers, so small. But for a year plus in, that I don't think that's too bad.
That's great.
Okay, well, hey, thanks. But I think the audience is primarily people that have people that are interested in wine. They maybe traveled a bit, and it's a lot of individuals who are in some sort of wine education program. So I don't want it to be a wine geek channel. I don't want to go in all these esoteric little tangents. I'm trying to make the audience a little more inclusive. And look, there's a lot of channels out there, and many of the channels you can hear the same sort of messages over and over. I try to bring in a lot of my personal experience. So hopefully there's some things that are a little different.
Yeah, I think that's the most valuable part. At the beginning, you mentioned that you are still learning all these different details, the search engine optimizations. I think all those things are important, and we can also work on those. But I think those are just the framing and are a lot less important than the actual content and the experience and the knowledge that the person shares. Because a lot of creators fall into this mistake when they just want to communicate, but they do not focus on the matter, or they do not have anything to communicate. There is just the communication, and they work and polish all these details, the search engine optimizations and everything. Maybe they reach huge views, but it's a little bit empty. But this is, I think, the ideal situation when a person with a background, with an experience, with a profession comes in, has things to say, and the rest, the thumbnails and the titles, you can work those out. But even without optimizing anything, looking at your channel, it started growing quite fast in comparison to today's YouTube trends. So I think this really shows that the most important part is the experience that you share.
Oh,
and the authenticity.
I sincerely, I appreciate that very much. But it's a little bit like when I watch your channel. I think you're providing a fantastic service. It's insightful. There's a whole range of topics that are covered. I think what you're doing is something that has a lot of value. And, on my side with my channel, that's the intent, is someone can watch a video and maybe they come away with something where they go, oh, I learned a little something today. And if that's the case, I think it's a win. Hopefully they come back or they share it with some friend and they get some other people to view the videos as well. That would be great for long term. But my thought is it's a very long play. YouTube is something where you need to be consistent and you need to be true to yourself. And, that's my intent. So it's not my primary job at all. I work full time. I travel a lot, and I try to bring YouTube in on some of the travel. I work on YouTube oftentimes nights, weekends, off times. I enjoy it, and it's really been quite fulfilling. But for me, it's something it really helps me to maybe keep connected to some aspects of the wine world that I don't work in day to day. And I just have a lot of fun talking to people. People have been really good. And if I can help someone, maybe give them the tiniest amount of inspiration to continue on their wine journey, happy days. That's a good end result.
Exactly. I think this makes it even more genuine that this is not your job. So everybody can feel it. And even from the fact that you answer the comments, there are huge discussions. It really, really feels like you just want to communicate with people and want to share your story.
Well, it feels the same with your channel as well. But I think it's important. It's whatever topic you watch on YouTube. And I have to say, this may sound strange. I subscribe to almost no wine YouTube channels. I hardly watch any wine YouTube, hardly any. And the reason for that is I live it every day. And there's just times where I say, I've got some downtime. I'd like to watch something else. And, I subscribe to just a handful of channels, yours being one of them.
Well, thank you. That's a great honor. What do you watch besides, you mentioned that not really wine channels? What kind of channels, just out of curiosity?
A lot of travel. So I love to travel, and so I'm oftentimes doing a good amount of research before I go on a trip. So a lot of it is travel, and also a lot of it ties to cooking. So there's some sort of food element. Those two things I spend a lot of time on. And I think, again, it's a little bit of the same mindset with wine. It's all about the exploration and something new, different. There's always something out there to learn. So yeah, that's where I spend a lot of my time. But in the wine space, I subscribe to you. I subscribe to Matthew Horkey.
Yeah.
And the reason for that, I traveled with Matthew last year. I think he's a wonderful guy. We had a good time.
Exactly.
And the other one I subscribe to, and I don't know if she's making videos anymore, is Erin Larkin in Australia. She reviews wines for the Wine Advocate, and I think her channel, heavy focus on Australian wine. I think she's very insightful. She has interesting guests, and I like the content from her as well.
Okay, I should check her out. And yeah, I do agree. Matthew Horkey is also great. We had him on the podcast episode. It was a very interesting conversation as well. I would also recommend the channel for you, Konstantin Baum. He's also a master of wine, and he's one of my favorite wine YouTube channels as well.
Yeah, well, yeah, he's been at it for, I'm going to say 7 or 8 years. He's been at it for a number of years.
On YouTube? Wow.
I think so. I think the early versions of his videos, I think the early versions were in German.
Oh, really?
I believe so. I may be wrong, but I believe so.
Oh, maybe, yeah. Now that you mentioned, I remember that one. I only started following him. I only discovered him like a year or 2 years ago. And now that you mentioned, maybe I remember that I checked his old videos on the channel. And yeah, probably it was in German.
The wine space on YouTube is interesting. You look at any number of other topics, especially cooking type of channels, and massive subscriber rates, and all of this engagement. With wine, it becomes much more targeted, and I think it's a challenge in wine in that when you try to present content that is not too simplistic, and something that doesn't go into, the finest detail. It's somewhere
Yeah.
trying to hit that sweet spot in between. At least that's my thought. That's quite challenging. And the other is because wine is so fragmented, sometimes you can try a number of wines and that person viewing it is in some other part of the world where they have access to none of those wines.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a tough one to crack.
Yeah, and if you try to solve this by talking about wines that are worldwide available, then you miss a huge part of the wine industry, and maybe at some point it can get boring for the people because only talking about these big heavy hitters. Yeah, it's difficult. But as you mentioned that comparing it to maybe to the gastronomy side of YouTube, where there are huge view numbers and huge reach, the wine segment is a lot smaller. What I've noticed, and I think we talked about this with Matthew as well, is that it's a lot more like serious or a deeper connection. If you look at your comment section or other wine videos comment section, there are lots of people very interested, writing huge paragraphs and quite large discussions, which I didn't really see on any other segment of YouTube. So maybe smaller community, but a tighter one.
It could be. I don't know. That seems to make sense. Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Interesting. Well, let's grow the wine community together. I would ask the audience to go and check out Bob's YouTube channel. It's fantastic. Everybody should check it out and go help him reach the 10,000 subscriber mark.
I appreciate it. Yeah, please do check out my channel. If it's something that catches your interest,